All right, next up, the religious right and its connection to extremism. One audience member asked me this question on the night. She said, the vast majority of right-wing groups in Australia are not embedded in any form of extremism. Shouldn't these extremists be treated more like terrorists rather than right-wing groups, as they do not represent the right-wing worldviews at all? Can neo-Nazi radical groups in Australia be called terrorists for their actions rather than right-wing politics? Now, this seems to be asking whether right-wing groups should be treated like terrorists or not. And I also happen to know, based on the briefing I received beforehand, that this question was intended to unpack a discussion about the religious right, quote unquote, and its connections to extremism, although time ran out and that never really happened. So I'm going to address both of those points. First, the words thrown around in these sorts of debates, like right-wing extremist or white supremacist or neo-Nazi, these words have meaning. You know, if you are that, then you're going to wind up on an ASIO watch list. Whatever the counter-terrorism agency in your country, they're going to get interested in you. Because these types of people are interested in ideological and political violence. So the distinction between a right-wing extremist and someone who is right-wing is really kind of significant. To say that they're the same is like saying that the Labour Party is the same as communism, because they've got trade unions. Or that Australia Day, because it's nationalistic, is a demonstration of fascism. The comparisons are not just absurd, they're insulting. They are not the same in very important and very fundamental ways, the most significant of which is violence. And regarding the so-called religious right and the notion that it is somehow connected with violence or extremism, I want to address that specifically. Jesus said to Pontius Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world, or else my servants would fight." He also said in response to Peter's act of violent resistance when he pulled out his sword, when Jesus was going to get arrested, Jesus said to him, "Those who live by the sword die by the sword." There's no room in Christianity whatsoever for political violence. To engage in that is to resist the teaching of Christ and the apostles, because the apostles picked this up. You look at something like Romans 13, where Apostle Paul says, every person is to be subject to the governing authorities. There's no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has resisted the ordinance of God. In addition, the teachings of Christ are consistently and explicitly non-violent. Take this, for example. He says, have you heard that it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth? But I say to you, do not show opposition against an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other toward him also. And I could use countless examples of this kind of thing. I could go on and on. There's no way around the non-violent aspect of Christianity. And Christianity in this respect is to be contrasted with Islam, which is connected, which requires political domination and power. It is a political system of submission. Christianity doesn't require any such thing. Indeed, Christianity exists quite apart from political power. Doesn't mean it doesn't have anything to say to politics or political power. If it didn't, I'd be out of a job. Half the prophets never would have existed. But it exists apart from political power itself. It doesn't live within political power, unlike something like Islam. It is an otherworldly kingdom, which is not embedded in worldly systems and power structures. It is a spiritual kingdom by which God reigns in the hearts of men and women first, and in their spiritual transformation, and their transformation in their hearts and souls and minds transforms their world as salt and light, as Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5. That is also why there's no intelligence agency anywhere in the entire world that has a category known as Christian extremism. There are no Presbyterian terrorist cells. There's no Pentecostal anarchist groups. There's nothing like this anywhere in the world. Extremist violence is Islamic, neo-Nazi, far left, far right. It's not Christian. It's also Marxist, which brings me to my next point, because I want to turn to an argument which is often made that people who are right of centre are somehow fueling or connected to right-wing extremism. I mentioned the analogy before with, well, that's like saying Labour or communists, for example. This was done to Donald Trump, for example. He was continually forced in every debate and media interview to distance himself from white supremacy. Not because he had said anything that was white supremacist or apologised for white supremacy. It was for no real good reason, but it was to try and connect him in some way through the media narrative to white supremacy and right-wing extremism. And the ultimate example the media holds up as proof of their narrative is the Capitol insurrection. This, they say, was proof of the dangers of the far right. Or of just the right in general. Well, first things first. The Capitol insurrection was wrong. It was tragic. It is to be condemned in the strongest possible terms. Said absolutely everyone. The president said it, the Republicans said it, the Democrats said it, the media commentators left and right said it. I'm saying it right here and right now. I join them. But those who still try to make this connection, say a right-of-centre Trump presidency or other conservative types, and they say that they're connected to this Capitol insurrection and white supremacy and extremist violence, I want to say this. They ought to be very careful about the arguments that they use. Because that argument, if you are right, then you are this, it does not work in their favour. The Capitol riot on January the 6th, for example, resulted in a few dozen injuries. It resulted probably in 2 tragic deaths that were caused directly from the actual insurrection. It lasted for a day. It caused a modest amount of property damage. It was universally condemned. Prior to the Capitol riot, America lived through nearly a year of political violence about which we heard very, very little. The violence was almost entirely fueled by a left-wing movement, Black Lives Matter, and it kicked off in earnest with the death of George Floyd. It lasted from March 2020 to January 2021, and it's just started up again quite severely. But for example, just in the period May to August of 2020, 3 months, you saw over 10,000 Black Lives Matter demonstrations in America. 5 to 10% of them were violent. There was 8,700 Black Lives Matter demonstrations internationally. 55 National Guard deployments across America were required in a similar period of time. 10% of those protests had to be met with force, which was an increase in the use of force against demonstrations, political demonstrations, of over 500% based on 2019. In just a 2-month period, that is May and June, nearly 10,000 protesters were arrested. Insurable damages caused by the civil unrest throughout this period will ultimately result in a figure of $1 to $2 billion just of insurable damage. That sets a new record for insurable damages on civil unrest in American history, and that is categorized by the insurance industry as catastrophic, which usually follows a major natural disaster like a hurricane or a cyclone. By October 2020, 25 people had died directly from the Black Lives Matter riots. 4 police officers had been non-fatally shot. Dozens more died indirectly in crimes in the vicinity of the riots, like the looting that took place, for example. These marches occurred under a banner. The banner said, "Black Lives Matter." They were telling us who they were. This is left-wing violence, about which we hear so little, and yet which is so prevalent. This left-wing violence, it has many politicians in America excusing it, including leading Democrats, explicitly excusing it. This left-wing violence is something that our own Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormack, tried to call out, and he was pounced on by the mainstream media. Well, here's the thing. All violence is wrong. End of story. The Capitol insurrection was wrong. The Black Lives Matter violence is wrong. Some of the associated Antifa violence is wrong. Right-wing extremism is wrong. And I say that, but many people who are on the left of politics, and I avoid left-right binaries, I really do, but in this one I can't, because there are quite a few people on the left of politics who don't say that. They exploit instances of right-wing violence and excuse instances of left-wing violence. Why? Because when you do that, you're not into this for the politics. You're not into this because of the principle, I should say, which is that violence is wrong. You're into this, you guessed it, for the politics of it, to try and paint the narrative about the religious right and about the right-wingers and about the extremism and the rise of Nazism and all this. And this is all based on the fact that there has been an uptick in these things, right? And that's something that ASIO is monitoring, and I'm very, very grateful for it. But it's not because of the existence of people who are right of centre. It's something else altogether. I'm personally actually more concerned about the left-wing variant, and I'm concerned more about it for this reason. It is supported too often from the inside. Right-wing violence is quickly marginalised, quickly condemned, and it lies at the fringe. We saw that with the Capitol insurrection. Left-wing violence has apologists within governments, within media, within big tech. In fact, the latest news just tonight is that Facebook have been censoring the sharing of the New York Post story about the Black Lives Matter co-founder who's just bought 4 houses. Come on, that is outrageous. That's on the level of communist media censorship. This is not fringe at all. It is being welcomed by our institutions and by our elite. Hey, one more thing. I've been looking at the metrics and I figured out something. You guys are watching the videos and not subscribing. So please help us out a great deal by hitting the like button and then hitting subscribe, hitting the bell as well so you get the notifications. It helps us out a really great deal, and you can click here to see more videos.